in terms in
Sorry.
terms in terms of the association between neurodivergence and gender issues, and it goes beyond autism to ADHD as well. A surprisingly high proportion of young people with ADHD also have a range of issues around sexuality and gender. In terms of offending behavior, and I use the term offending in inverted commas, the higher risk of suicide, and of course, putting it into a political context, it fits very uneasily with the debate that's taking place at the moment around gender. But we're not going to shirk away from that because in our collaborative, the AISee Collaborative, which consists of Corrie, myself, and Tom Kirkwood, we don't want to duck those issues. And in fact, a lot of the work we do is about trying to fill in gaps and going into territory that is perhaps uncomfortable for others to do. I'd like to thank, on behalf of AISee, Corrie and Three Sisters, who have provided the time and the research that goes into this webinar at no cost. But hopefully, if there are 40 attending, someone's going to take away something. And I think it will probably be from the case study. It might be to take away disagreement, which is absolutely fine, or challenge, which is also absolutely fine. But given that it's a very contentious area, the one thing I would ask is that there is a respect for different opinions, different professional opinions. I know that I'm going to disagree with some things, and I'm sure that between, if there are 40 of us, there will be 40 different understandings of this set of issues, which we should respect. So, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Corrie and ask her to try and develop our thinking and understanding around this complex area. So, Corrie, over to you.
Thank you very much. And Bill, is it okay if I ask you if people come into the waiting room to admit them in?
Yes, of course.
Thank you so much. Okay. All right. So thank you everyone for coming today. We really appreciate it. Thank you for taking your time. We understand it's an awkward time at lunchtime. So if people are having lunch, absolutely no problem. So it's myself and Bill who are here today. I work both for AISee Collaborative and for Three Sisters Consultancy. Three Sisters Consultancy, we focus on the intersectionality between additional support needs and sexuality and exploring LGBTQIA, because when we first started, the idea is that we were actually working one-to-one and in small groups with autistic children and young people. But we realized very early on that actually a lot of people needed support in learning about neurodivergency. From a personal background, I am neurodivergent myself. I'm not autistic. I mean, I'm not diagnosed autistic. I do have an autistic daughter. I am a carer for my autistic brother. So we are neurodivergent led. We are all queer at Three Sisters as well. So that's kind of where we stand. AISee Collaborative is a new collaborative. We've been around for about a year and a bit now, and we do training, we do support. We're currently working on some software and tech that I think will be life-changing for people in the future. So we would love for you guys to be able to learn a little bit about us, and we've made sure that we've left our emails on the last page as well. So that's us selling ourselves to you. Let's actually go on with it. So as Tom said, working together, um, confidentiality, we do ask you if you're going to share stories, if you can anonymize them. That would make a huge difference because obviously some of the people that we're talking about today are vulnerable. For me, myself, I have had permission to share the case studies from the individuals, but I've also anonymized them by changing their names and some of the details. But if you would like to share, please do. We love to hear from other people. We'd love to hear your questions. Listen how you need to listen. Listen, I've got raging ADHD. I'm currently playing with a fidget toy. If you need to get up and do jumping jacks, if you need to go and have a movement break, that's totally fine. And engage how you need to engage as well. We would love to see your beautiful faces, but we're also aware that not everyone has that opportunity due to where they are, the setting they're in. We also want to acknowledge that LGBTQIA plus knowledge is varied amongst professionals. And when Three Sisters goes out and does gender and sexuality training, we thought we would be talking about what it's like to be autistic and what it's like to be neurodivergent. But honestly, about 2/3 of the time, it's going through the letters. What does L mean? What does G mean? What does B mean? Um, because there's such a varied amount of knowledge, but also there's quite a lot of I've nearly said fake news, but do you know what I mean? There's quite a lot of mis-knowledge out there as well. But we want to acknowledge that not everyone has the same level of knowledge, and people will have different views. But our role is prioritizing our professional role, and we'll be looking at what our professional roles are. We do not need to understand or experience having not being heterosexual or not being cisgender in order to help and listen people. We ask you to monitor your airtime just because there's more people here. So if we hear one person talking more than others, I might have to tell you to step back. I'm really blunt, so I'm very, very sorry if it's offensive. And be kind to yourself. I think this is a scary topic for a lot of people. I think for a lot of people, often we're working with children in crisis. So we want you to be kind to yourself when we're talking about this. But I just realized before there, I asked you, please tell you where you are in the world and what is your role. And some of you have already put it, so that's great. Parent of autistic child, thank you. Work in disability field, says Leanne, and live in Shetland. Hi, Leanne. I love Shetland. I I go there lots. My best friend lives there. I was there in September. I will probably be there in September again. It's my second home. I love it. Um, Balletti has said lives in Glasgow, have an autistic son. Regan says, my name is Regan. I work as a mental health practitioner. Okay. Learned disability nursing. Pupil support teacher. Thank you, Kerry, for coming in Shetland. Brilliant. No problem with ICT issues. That's fine. These things happen. Ashley is Shetland's Women's Aid. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. I think, Ashley, I've met you before. I feel like I have. Hi, Rhonda, another Shetlander. So many Shetlanders. I love it. ASN teacher. Thank you, Fiona, for coming. Alison, lovely to see you, Alison. From North Ayrshire. We've got Lynn and Fiona Shearer, senior house parents and halls of residence in Shetland. Hi, Lynn, nice to see you as well. Hi, Daria, Ukrainian refugee and a carer of autistic son. Nice to meet you. We've got Katrina, teaching music at Buchanan. Hi, Katrina. I know Katrina. We have Victoria. I work with autistic children, not engaging education. I'm in Glasgow. Yes, you are. And you also live around the corner from me and raised my child with me. So thank you for coming, Victoria. Zoe, she's from Shetland. Work as community connector. London, mental health service. My goodness, another Shetlander. Right, ASN school and high school. Isla from the Scottish Borders. Wonderful to see lots of people and also some parents here. I think that's really, really important as well, because we will be thinking about the parent perspective because it can be a real challenge as well. I should also say that I'll be sharing the experience within my family of my brother-in-law who is a trans man, and I spend a lot of time talking with his mum, but her experience of that, he is also waiting on an autism assessment too. We're swimming in autism over in this part of my world. So thank you so much for all of that information. That really helps us understand the context of where we are. I should also say that I am non-binary. I use they, them pronouns. So yeah. Okay.
Can I only say very briefly, Corrie, and from my experience, and just to put this into context, that it was not very long ago that I raised the issue with the regulatory authorities about autistic behaviors. Oh, sorry, let me rephrase that. About really child protection safeguarding issues around sexualized behavior. And not even sexualized behavior, because that's pushing it too far, but behaviors that could be interpreted as sexualized.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know the question, do we treat these, do we have to treat these as child protection issues? Do we treat them as issues related to disability or neurodiversity? And I couldn't get any answers from anybody. No regulator would commit to an answer. I was told you'll have to go to the Procurator Fiscal to find out. So that it's a very, very grey and murky area, and it places tremendous pressure on the professionals who are attending today, working in front line, but also parents as well, knowing what is right and wrong in using that terminology, the right thing to do. So I'm hoping that we get. I suspect we won't get as much clarity as we want, and that's not because of you, Corrie, but because of the framework in which we're working. But anyway, sorry to interrupt, but that's
no. I love an interruption, Bill. I love an interruption. Okay, so we'll start with our position in gender. So listen, I'm not going to read all of them out, all right? But fundamentally, we believe that someone's identity is not up for debate, and we do not work with organizations or individuals who have an anti-trans ideology or transphobic affiliations. So we just wanted to say that straight up. Um, these sort of training that we did 5, even 10 years ago were not really debated with us, to be honest with you. We would go in, we would work with young people, we would work with, in fact, Victoria Castelli, who I have worked with for nearly 8 years now. When I worked with her, there was just no challenges, but because of the current media climate, that has changed drastically. And there has been a lot of tension when we're talking about these topics. So we just wanted to get our views out there before we continued. All right, so what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to be thinking about what the current research tells us. Now, this research needs to be updated again. Right now, we're having to update it every 6 months because there's so much research coming out and because it is such a hot topic. We're going to be thinking about why some autistic young people might need extra support to explore their gender and sexuality, but also look at some anonymised real life case studies that show the complexities of the approach we take. Now, I originally started off, as I said, delivering sexual health, relationship sexual health, and parenthood sessions to the children and young people with additional support needs. But right now, all of my one-to-one case study work is with gender non-conforming children and young people who are either confused or challenging their sense of gender and sexuality. So I think that shows, and we'll see the statistics of why that might be later. So what is the Scottish context? Well, here's all the legislation, right? All the stuff that we all love to read about, right? So there is the CAST report, or the CAST review was very recent last year, and that has led to a UK ban on prescribing puberty blockers to those under the age of 18 experiencing gender dysphoria, except for patients who are already or except from existing patients or clinical trial. I think this was a huge blow to a lot of our pupils and our young people who potentially were looking to get some support to have puberty blockers. And I think this has very much impacted the mental health of some of the young people we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about one of those in the case studies. The Equality Act, that supports our children as well. The Children and Young People Scotland Act supports our young people. And the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, and therefore the Scotland UNCRC Act as well. And there's also guidance for teachers in this. So if you're ever looking for what is my role or how does this relate to me and my professional capacity, then ta-da, here is all here, right? So you've got it all here for future reference. But also I wanted to acknowledge the current NHS waiting lists, because I think this is going to be a huge part, especially around gender identity clinics. Now, this is just for Glasgow. This is not for the whole of Scotland, but I think it's a really interesting thing to see actually that the amount of people who are going for gender identity clinic referrals is increasing dramatically, but also the amount of waiting time is increasing dramatically. On a personal level, my brother-in-law, he is about to turn 31 and he's still waiting for one of his gender affirming surgeries. And he got referred when he was 19. So that kind of shows that people are sometimes waiting decades to get this kind of support. So when we're thinking about how we support our young autistic young people, we have to keep in mind that there's not going to be a short term or a quick answer for gender dysphoria, especially if they're looking for medical intervention. So I just wanted to flag this up, and I've linked up as well the resource and data for it. But also this GCC, Glasgow City Council did some really good in-depth stuff about how these referrals were made. So 49 were self-referrals, 30 were by their GP, and the range for other sources. 73% of them were natal females with male gender identity. But the big one for me is that 55% of those in the waiting list had a formal diagnosis of a neurodevelopmental condition, with another 15 waiting a formal diagnosis. And those are people who either know that they are neurodivergent or suspect they are neurodivergent. There will be so many other young people who we might suspect are neurodivergent, but it hasn't been a conversation that comes up yet. So that's something we need to think about. So there clearly is a link between neurodevelopmental conditions and gender dysphoria, and we'll be talking about what that is later. So here, and I really like this little graph because it shows that actually the increase in the amount of people who have wanted to get gender affirming care has increased dramatically. And people can have lots of debates about why that is, but I think part of it is that we're opening the conversation, is that Gen Z and Generation Alpha, they are a lot more open-minded. Gender and sexuality are seen as a lot more fluid. Uh, Platforms like, for example, TikTok and Instagram are creating safe spaces for children and young people to access this kind of information that potentially they didn't have before when they're socially isolated within their, let's say, small village. So I wanted to put that as well. So what does current research tell us about the link between autism, sexuality, and gender? Well, first of all, in general, the same proportion of disabled people and non-disabled people are living in a gender that were not assigned at birth. They wear the clothes that they like to wear that might not necessarily be the same gender expression that they had assigned at birth. They have the right to choose the romantic and sexual partners. They might express unique sexual preferences privately and with partners. And for this, I'm specifically talking about things like fetishes. But the expression of these preferences, the opportunity to live them, might be very vastly different. And I'm thinking about some of the young people that I work with, for example, who their parents still choose their clothes that they wear. You know, it might be that the family choose what social media they get to access. It might be that the family get to choose what kind of role models they have out there. They could have much smaller lives, for example. I remember working with a family who had an autistic young man who was non-verbal, and every day after school he wore his mum's nightie, and he bounced on the trampoline. Now the problem was that the trampoline was outdoors, and he was a 6 foot man wearing a nightie. And as you can add up the maths on that, why that might be inappropriate. But everyone was saying it's a sensory thing. It's because of this and it's because of that. But no, this individual really wanted to dress in dresses. This individual really, really liked the feeling and felt good in them. But because that conversation wasn't necessarily accessible to take place, then that person didn't have the opportunity to have those conversations until we came along. So, but we do know that, as we said, some of our kids might not necessarily have the opportunities in the same way that their neurotypical peers do. But also, we know that individuals with ASD report increased homosexuality, bisexuality, asexuality, and decreased heterosexuality. But that's a very small study. And I wanted to say that actually only 200 people is too small a study to really present a whole population. And also, people don't tend to perform gender in the same way. And this is something that I have noticed even within my daughter. I didn't really realize how much gender norms even affect this generation until I had my daughter, where on her first birthday, she got a kitchen and she got a cleaning set and she got a mini Hoover. But her cousin, who's 9 months older, got a monster truck and he got a fireman costume. And it was so interesting to see that. But my daughter doesn't necessarily perform gender in the way that maybe some of her peers do. It doesn't seem to matter to her, in the way that some of the other girls within her nursery are talking about gender. And this is something we see again and again with our young people, is the idea of being a girly girl, the idea of being a hyper masculine man isn't necessarily something that is visually presented within autistic young people that at least I work with. But the saying goes, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, and everyone has a very different experience of what gender means to them. I think also to take into point is that often our autistic children don't necessarily pick up on the social cues or think about necessarily, or sometimes even care about that. I know a lot of our girls sometimes are a lot more aware when they're highly masking, but if you don't necessarily pick up on the gender norms that are happening around you, then you might not then apply that to how you present yourself, whether it is socially or physically. But there's
Corrie,
all,
can I just an interesting point where you
yeah,
talk
go for
about
it.
about environment and environmental influences on gender. When we work with a lot of young people, boys with autism, they might tend to shun their natural peer group of other boys and veer more towards the girls.
Yes.
So it's working two ways, isn't it? It's um, they may become more influenced by female stereotypes by choice
Yeah.
or by selection
Hmm.
rather than anything else. So it's very difficult to disentangle the nature
Yes.
nurture argument in cases like that.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it's an absolutely fascinating topic, and it's something that we need more research in. But I'm not a researcher; I wouldn't even know how to begin to talk about that. But it's certainly very interesting, Bill. Thank you for sharing that. So we're having, listen, this is very early information that's coming up. We know that lower percentages reported a dislike of their natal body or wish for hormones or surgery. So we know that autistic children and young people are less likely to want medical information. In one very small study, 7.8% of people referred to a gender clinic, it was actually in the Netherlands, were autistic, compared to a roughly 1% of the population in general in the Netherlands. And autistic people don't tend to perform gender in the same way, as we've talked about already. But, it's such a hard thing to measure. What does it mean to be a girl? What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be gender non-conforming? And a lot more research needs to be done. Even when I didn't realize I was non-binary until I was 29. But when I think about my university years, when girls went out, everyone wore a dress, everyone wore heels, everyone wore makeup, everyone did their hair. But now, when you see young people going out now, the girls aren't necessarily wearing heels at all. They're dressed a lot more casually. They're not necessarily wearing a lot of makeup. So even generation by generation, the gender expression is changing quite drastically as well. So that's something to take into account as well. But yeah, the fact that, you're 3 to 6 times more likely to be transgender, or at least be gender non-conforming or gender diverse if you're autistic, is, I think, a huge statistic to take forward. So why some autistic young people might need extra support? Well, I'm gonna bounce the question straight back to you guys. Feel free to shout out loud. Feel free to put in the chat. Why do you think some autistic people might need extra support to explore their gender and sexuality? What do you guys think? I see lots of people typing. If anyone wants to unmute themselves, they can also do that. Learning about boundaries and other people's personal space, absolutely. In fact, I'm working with a young person tomorrow around that topic. Yep. Struggling to understand their feelings. Yes, alexithymia. Or is it alexithymia? Absolutely. If we're, and this is one of the problems with gender dysphoria, and we'll be talking about that later. Difficulties with emotion recognition. Daria, you're in the same uh, lane as Gaynor coming about that. Coping with changes in their body. Absolutely, Alison. There was one individual I remember, and she's a girl and she's cisgender, and she said that for a while she genuinely thought she was a boy because she didn't want her hips, she didn't want her breasts, and it's because she had huge sensory issues around her clothing. And all she wore was jeans and joggies and a hoodie. And then suddenly she was noticing that her body felt very different when she was wearing those clothes. So she would tell her mum all the time, I don't want to have hips, I don't want to have breasts. And everyone had then assumed that she was saying, well, I want to be transgender, I want to be a man. But actually, no, she was talking about the discomfort of the physical changes around puberty. Um, Zoe, some people might not even know it's an option. Absolutely, compet. Compet is a short way of saying comprehensive heterosexuality or comprehensive uh, cisgenderism, I suppose. There must be heteronormative gender. The idea that everyone presumes that you will be cisgender, everyone presumes that you will be straight. It's a huge thing that happens. Even thinking about, you get 4 and 5 year olds who ask, "Oh, when are you gonna have your first boyfriend?" It's just so ingrained in a culture. So I think that's a really important point to point out as well. And one of the young people we worked with through another project with Tiny Changes, she told us that she had no idea that you could be trans because when she was growing up, it was Little Britain was her only reference. And as you can imagine, that didn't go great. So she thought, well, everyone mocks someone for dressing up in ladies' clothes, so I can't do that. So it wasn't really an option for her growing up at all. Um, Ashley has said, I think stigma around adults talking, yep, to autistic young people about sexuality and relationships with limited opportunities, absolutely. And it says, yes, sometimes autistic girls can feel like they don't fit in with other girls because of lack of understanding. Absolutely, absolutely as well. So yeah, there's so much depth and complexity to why some of our kids might really, really struggle with this. So what are the challenges? Well, you've actually kind of highlighted quite a lot of them. So they're already navigating one challenging subject, which is their self-identity. A lot of our kids talk about feeling different, talking about feeling like an alien, feeling left out, feeling singled out often at times. So then when they're having this additional layer of they're not heterosexual or they're not cisgender, then that can be really challenging for them. Also, a lot of our kids have less access to social experience or broader social group, you know. I'm thinking about those times that you know, if you're a girl and you kiss a girl when you're 14 and you just want to try it out and all that kind of stuff. Sometimes if you don't have a social group that allows for that, or in general, you don't have friends, you don't necessarily get to experiment with your sexuality and gender then in the way that your realistic peers can. Also, information can be confusing and abstract. Now, I was part of the pilot and co-wrote the Scottish curriculum for relationships, sexual health, and parenthood, and it's here, www.rshp.scot. My role was to think about the additional support needs of it. They have since added a complex needs section as well, and there is an additional support needs session as well. But it's true. Um, I would say 15, 20 years ago, when I was going into schools and talking to children and young people, often they had zero understanding or awareness of their own bodies and how they're growing up, never mind talking about gender and sexuality. Sometimes within uh, mainstream schools, children were removed from the sessions and then no one gave any follow up after that, which, as you can imagine, was problematic. So, absolutely, the information can be confusing, it can be abstract. For example, they use a video about consent called Cup of Tea, which is very funny. And it's all about how, oh, you wouldn't give a cup of tea to a unconscious person. If someone wants a cup of tea the night before, they don't want a cup of tea today. And it's a metaphor for sex and consent. But the first time I showed it, three of the young men in the group said, I don't like tea. And that was it. They had no interest in the rest of the conversation because they couldn't, because they were such literal thinkers. All they were thinking about is the tea rather than the concept of consent. So, absolutely. Also, identity isn't black and white. It's really difficult. You know, it's such a spectrum and it's so difficult to try and identify groups. And one of the things that I hear a lot from people who are questioning or struggling to understand LGBTQIA young people is, why are there so many more names? Why are there so many more flags? Why are there many more identities? And it's because this is the first time that a lot of our kids are having the opportunity to explore this and to put a name to an experience. So that's why, for example, we see a lot more young people with different pronouns, neo pronouns, for example.
Corrie, can I again interrupt? I do apologize,
Yeah, go
but
for it.
yeah, I think you've just raised something that's of critical importance when you talked about the cup of tea
Mm-hmm.
anecdote, which it leads me to think that if you're working with young people who have issues around gender and autism, you've got to be very careful in your use of language and use of metaphor, and
Yes,
very careful in any off-the-peg program that may have
yes.
been developed. And the emphasis is much more on the individualization, knowing the individual and how they work, and being quite direct with them, rather than skirting around the subject as you might with a neurotypical population. Is that fair in your experience?
Absolutely. I think there aren't a lot of resources out there that support learning about gender and abstract, but often they are existing. They go, you can be whoever you want to be. And sometimes autistic kids are going, but I don't know who I am. And actually, you do need to spend a
Yeah.
lot more time supporting them with that. So thank you for Bill for pointing that out. Also, I should say, and I forgot to say at the start, we will be sending you a copy of these slides and you'll be able to access the video recording as well. So for people who feel like they need to furiously write, I hope that you don't feel that way anymore. I should have said that before we started. Also, lack of disabled LGBTQIA role models in the media. It's getting better. But there aren't a lot of queer disabled people, queer autistic people in the media, at least out. But also higher prevalence of mental health problems. So are we dismissing young people who are autistic because we're saying, for example, oh, they have high anxiety, or oh, they have borderline personality, or oh, they have depression, when actually there's some gender dysphoria there, and actually that's going to be part of a conversation we're going to be having about a case study, and also challenge expression complex emotions. As that's something all of you picked up on, and also puberty can create such drastic changes. And as I said, I was talking about the young woman who wanted to get a breast. She wanted to. She kept on talking about getting a breast reduction, and actually, she said she wanted her breast completely removed. But upon investigation, it was because she didn't like the feeling of her breasts in the clothing that she was currently wearing. So it's a real challenge for our young people. It really, really is. But also, let's think about the exploration and some and sexuality and attraction. So, a lot of our autistic children, young people, might have later sexual experiences. And something that I heard a lot when I started in this role was, oh, a lot of autistic children and young people are asexual. They have, and that's who they are. But some of our young people who are autistic might be socially more immature. And it might be that actually their interest in sexuality and romantic and sexual relationships is a little bit delayed. I think of my brother as a perfect example. He showed absolutely no interest in dating, and wanting a partner of any kind until he was in his mid-20s. And he actually only truly started looking for that in his late 20s, early 30s. So it took him a little bit longer to explore his own sexuality. Um, Also, often our kids don't have access to LGBTQIA friendly resources. LGBT Youth Scotland, for example, are a wonderful charity, and we did some research for them, but it can be really difficult for them to access ASN settings because there's so much barriers with doing, for example, the program that they might be doing within mainstream schools. Also, they might have a less comprehensive education system when it comes to RSHP and be less exposed to LGBTQIA culture. I think very much how you grow up, what you watch on the telly, who you watch on YouTube, the people you talk to can make a huge difference to your understanding of that. An example from my experience, I honestly thought that everyone was bisexual growing up because most of the people in my mum and dad's life were queer, even if they were both heterosexual. So I just presumed that everyone didn't necessarily care about the gender of their sexual attraction. And it wasn't until I was 14 when I learned about sexuality and gender, I went, oh, not everyone's on the same page as me. Okay, so people have to make a choice. And that was genuinely stunning for me. But I am very much an exception to the rule. Most people are taught, well, this is the way it is, and this is how you're supposed to grow up, and this is who you should marry, and then you should have children, etc., etc., etc. Also, a lot of our young people really struggle with romantic relationships. And romantic relationships are difficult at any age. And one thing that we get a lot of Three Sisters is, oh, can you come and talk about um, what a healthy relationship is, what a romantic relationship is like? And answer is, well, I mean, yes, but are you able to answer that question? Because I don't think I am necessarily. We can talk about what red flags are. We can talk about positive relationships. We can talk about negative experiences. But how do you get a boyfriend or girlfriend or partner isn't something that really exists. But a lot of our young people are looking for some sort of guidebook on that doesn't exist. Also, do our children have any queer icons? Well, since making this, the answer is now yes. I'm thinking about Hannah Gadsby, an absolute legend, and they are a comedian, they are a best-selling author, and they talk about their experience of gender and of their sexuality. Fern Brady, a Scottish comedian, who is openly bisexual and very recently was diagnosed as autistic and has a wonderful autobiography. Oh my goodness, please please do read it. It's wonderful. These are good examples of queer autistic people who are coming out and talking about this. Um, but a lot of our kids already struggle with the feeling of being different, of being bullied, of being othered. And I know from working with one person I'm working with right now, she feels that even though she's a trans girl and she's not out at school, she would just rather wait till she goes to college and start there, be socially transitioning, because the idea of having to come out in the last 3 months of her career at high school while she's also doing her exams, it sounds like absolute torture for her. So she actually does want to hold back, not because she doesn't want to socially transition, but because she's aware of the impact it might have on how people treat her within her peers treat her, which is absolutely wild, but a reality that a lot of our children have, you know. Um, Bill, you had put a good question in here.
Yeah, it goes back to some professional experiences where we notice the link between aggressive behaviors and sexual urge, unsatisfied sexual urges, given
Yeah,
that it may be that certain members of the autistic population find it difficult to use fantasy
yeah.
as a support in self-relief, and the degree to which we could or should be assisting self.
Mm,
I'm thinking, and maybe this is something wrong with my brain, but I tend to think more about young males than young females, but
mhm.
it may not be the case that unsatisfied sexual urges, as libido builds in early adolescence, can lead to quite challenging behavior, and the degree to which supporting those young people in managing their own challenging behavior is actually helping them managing their sexual urges, and that means getting into some fairly intimate and complex areas. And again, I don't know if that's something you might be able to address during this session.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually just finished a couple of weeks ago with a young person who autistic, nonverbal, didn't know how to masturbate. Um, and that was becoming a problem because they were now 17 and showing incredibly aggressive behavior just because of out of pure frustration.
Yeah.
Doing things like leading other children into the quiet room, trying to get people to touch his private parts when they were changing his pad, just for some sort of relief. And I was able to support them to do a story that was a social story that's very, very basic, but also we now have visuals that are actually practical from Lowly and NHS, because what we used to have to do is show them a line drawing, and our autistic young people would be like, what is this still drawing of a person holding their penis got to do with me? So you're right, it's changing quite radically and it is a high risk thing to do. But what we have noticed through our work is the amount. Well, first of all, often the parents say that their son or daughter disappears for 2 weeks into their bedroom and you don't see them because they finally figured out how to do it. But that stress level's disappeared. But also within school, they're able to say not here, but at home. There's a sense of it's no longer no naughty. It's this isn't an appropriate place to do it, but you do have access to be able to do that at home. Um, so
Yeah,
yes,
I
yes,
think Kerry's raised that very interesting point about, you know, once you start going down this route, which I'm not saying is the wrong route at all, but you find yourself in all sorts of difficulties in terms of safe
yeah,
pornography and unsafe pornography
yeah,
and vulnerability,
yes,
and all of that sort of thing. But you know, one of the critical points that I think it would be that the many of the attendees they will sympathise with is that the instant lurch towards condemning what is inappropriate rather than highly sexualized behavior. So, you know, a boy in my school who would expose himself and masturbate publicly until, you know, certain social stories were developed and so certain strategies were put in place. So the alternative would have been that he would be punished. You know,
yeah,
he would be convicted of
yeah,
something, and
yeah.
that's why I go back to my original point about when it's a child protection issue, when it's more about an issue of supporting a disability.
And it's such a fine line between, because actually, as I said, when NHS Lothian released resources that showed someone masturbating, both with a vulva and with a penis, everyone in my community lost their mind. They're like, "Oh my God, it's happened! It's happened! It's happened!" Because we were so desperate to find something that was allowed. And it's so difficult to draw that line between, well, what is pornographic and what is visual, you know. I will, Elsa, I will make sure that I will put the link to the NHS resource. Absolutely no problem. I'm just going to make a to-do list. So NHS Lothian resource. I would say though, Elsa, if you are thinking about that, maybe we should have a conversation about how to go about that, because if you are going to show that visual, there needs to be a lot of prep before you get to that visual. There needs to be a lot of understanding, even if it's very basic. But yeah, absolutely no problem. I can link to those. All right, so gender dysphoria, let's think about what that is. Well, first of all, there's a wonderful video that I would have shown you in person if we were doing this in person, by a YouTuber called Evan Mark, and he's a trans autistic adult now, actually, not young person. And he talks about his experience as someone who had just come out and gone to university as a trans man. And the first thing we think about is that gender clinics often talk about, they want young people to talk about their feelings and their experiences about their gender, when actually that's something that a lot of our kids can't do with anything outside of their gender. And this is when he said, I don't feel like I'm my skeleton and I'm in the wrong flesh sack. Now, I know what that means, and you know what that means, right? But for a psychologist to then link that to gender dysphoria, you know, that can be tricky. Also, the rigid black and white thinking. So it might be that actually, if someone has presented particular difficulties, that can be really difficult to then assign gender dysphoria. For example, I worked years and years ago with an individual who was a trans woman but wanted to keep her beard because she had very bad acne. And when she shaved, the cystic acne would come back. And she was a mechanic and she worked outside. So she was saying, well, but I want to wear joggies and a hoodie because I'm a mechanic and I need to be outside. And I want to keep my beard because actually, when I shave my face, that feels really weird and I get cystic acne. So I'm just going to be a woman with a beard. And that kind of upset people, that idea of being a woman with a beard. And this is when Evan said I was absolutely 100%, I wasn't going to through puberty and my period and grow breasts. And this is actually something we're talking about in one of the case studies. Also, autistic people might find it difficult to tolerate the ambiguous transition period from one gender to the other. This is something that we see a lot in our work, where, and this is something that I think when we talk to especially parents and professionals who's known an individual for a long time, when someone eventually does come out, often they have spent years and years and years building up the courage or even the understanding of their own gender. So then when they say, I need some support with gender dysphoria, or I think I might be X, Y, and Z, often our children and young people want immediate results of, well, I've told you what I need, so can we go dress shopping today? Not understanding that maybe the relationships around them and the people around them might need some time to process in order to support them in the most effective way. And then the thing that really got me was when Evan said some of the gender weirdness merged into the general weirdness, you know. And he talks about how, oh, he was a weird autistic boy, autistic girl, but now he's a weird autistic trans boy, and how that the both of the weirdness melded together, and you know, really impacted him absolutely. So yes, do I have slides in other languages? Yeah, Shazzy, if you tell us what language, I'm sure ChatGPT will give me a shot at it. So Shazzy, if you could tell me what language, Bill, if you could write that down, that would be useful for moving forward. We can always translate these slides, absolutely. But then we've got our parents and carers. I think for parents of autistic children, often they will experience the same journey as parents of neurotypical children when it comes to accepting that their child is coming out. We hear a lot of, this is a phase, this is just because your friends are queer, it's because you're watching too many TikToks. We hear a lot of that kind of information. And I understand that often parents, when we speak to parents, it's not out of viciousness, it's not out of hate, it's not even out of bigotry. A lot of them worry about the idea of A, their child becoming an adult, but B, their child becoming even more vulnerable as a sexual adult because they are transgender, gender non-conforming, or are not heterosexual. Also, a lot of our kids don't have the possibility to explore their gender or the sexuality, and we get sometimes parents who says, "Well, how do you know if you haven't tried it? If you haven't kissed a girl or a boy, then how do you know if you're gay?" And so we have to kind of try and educate, but in a way that's actually really understanding and comes with gentleness and comes with compassion. Also, a lot of our parents are risk averse due to the perceptions of vulnerability, um, especially if we have parents who maybe do come from, for example, homophobic backgrounds where they see homosexuality as deviancy rather than as just a way of expressing your own sexuality. So that can be really difficult as well. But also parents might be worried about bullying, especially if their child is or is already experiencing, and we know that you're much more likely to be bullied if you're autistic. So a lot of these parents just want to protect their child. They want to, and we talk about he's my baby, she's my baby. This is something even my mum deals with. I remember my mum when she found contraception in my brother's house, she was horrified. And I was like, he's 34 and he's engaged. I'm delighted to find contraception in his house. But for her, that's still my baby. You know, he might be 34, but he's still my baby. There's also cultural and religious backgrounds can make a huge, huge difference as well. And also the cultural and religious backgrounds of other family members. This is something that we've noticed specifically in the last couple of years of really supportive, say mum or aunt, but maybe they're kind of slightly adjacent. So we've got grandparents, we've got uncles, people who are quite avidly transphobic or quite avidly homophobic, then that can be an issue and can cause issues around, for example, childcare. You know, if you have a very small life and you need support, for example, if you work shifts and your now trans daughter needs to go to their aunt's house, but that aunt doesn't necessarily believe in trans women, then you see how that can be a real difficulty for them on a practical level. But also access to relevant information. If you type into Google or even to YouTube trans women, it's a very different landscape than it was even 6 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago. There's so much misinformation out there that it's actually quite alarming. So here's my question to you guys. Does this resonate with any of your experiences that you've ever had in your role? Feel free to shout out. Feel free to type as well. Urdu, we can do that, Shazia. I'll translate the whole slides into Urdu, no problem.
I'll start it off with a young person who came to me for support, and he took his own life.
Mm-hmm.
He was a she, and he was unable to get the transition that he wanted. Very well supported in school,
Yeah.
but it was the delays in the gender assignment, plus because it's suicide being very complex, and there were multiple vulnerabilities there. It wasn't just gender; it was also leaving school, transitioning into the outside world, exam pressures, a lot of other things. But you know, that's the end result: someone taking their own life, and that's very, very sad. And I don't want to alarm parents here.
No.
Oh, you know, to over worry them, but we are talking about a high level of vulnerability.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about the individual that you're talking about that I never met. You know, they're already in a residential setting, and he was being supported wonderfully by your staff, and your staff very much accepted his gender. But it was almost the red tape around him that was the real issue to him getting the support he needed, both with his gender dysphoria and everything else in his life, really.
Yeah, very complex.
Very, very complex, very, very complex. Okay. Oh, if people want to put stuff in the chat, we'll come back to it. I know sometimes it's difficult to share stuff, especially if a lot of you are from the same area, which is what's happened today. So let's talk about the media. We're not going to spend too much time talking about the media, right? But we know that the media does impact how our autistic children perceive their sense of gender when it's written about and talked about in the media so much. So let's talk about it. Kerry says, I guess in a small community, there's somewhat limited opportunities anyway. Yeah. I mean, I think about, for example, Shetland, what you've had your second Pride March ever this year. So the fact that, you guys are finally getting a Pride March is absolutely wonderful, and it's so progressive, but it just shows that potentially, there are a lot more queer young people out there that don't necessarily feel like they can come out if you're in a very, very small village. If you live in Yale, I can't even imagine. Anyway, the UK public is clear and consistent. Trans issues are not a cause of national concern. So that's what we know. We have done polls, we have done research. It's not something that most people care about. And actually, of the 16 issues that were talked about the most in the press, trans people were at the bottom of that list. But here's some statistics. In the first month of 2016, the Telegraph published 10 articles related to trans people. But in January 2024, they ran 75 articles about trans people, and 73 of those were negative. So we're talking about a 650% increase in coverage, and none of it was positive. And this is the huge difference we're seeing. I wanted to show a Daily Mail coverage, for example, of the difference. It just wasn't really something that was necessarily talked about a lot. And I think this is why within our work, when we were doing training, I've been in a couple of schools, and there's a couple of people here from that school who were 99% were really, really supportive. But when there's one or two individuals, it can make it a very, very challenging environment to train in because of the views. And a lot of the articles that they're reading are coming from places like the Daily Mail, for example, or from the Telegram. And it's quite scary misinformation from quite a lot of it. But it's just so strange to me that it feels like it's come out of nowhere for something that wasn't necessary. I feel like people didn't really care about trans people living their lives as much 10 years ago as they do now. And the same people are still trans and gender non-conforming, and the same people are still just getting on with their lives, but the media has very much made this sandstorm. And if you are a autistic young person who's seeing this, who's watching the news, who's reading about it, who's following mainstream media, then it can be quite alarming to them as well. But we've already talked about this before. Managing expectations around the transition, if we are having a gender non-conforming person, can be very, very tricky because often there's a deep urgency. And I get that. I felt that myself when I became non-binary. I was like, right, what am I going to do to show the world that I'm non-binary? And it wasn't really until I explored it that I realized I don't need to show the world that I'm non-binary. But certainly the social transition is the one that most of our kids can access immediately because the waiting time for first appointments for young people are 2 to 5 years. And they're approximately 5 years for adults. And that's the waiting for their first appointment. That's not the waiting for getting gender affirming care. That's not the waiting for getting, for example, medical transitions. But also, trans disabled people are much more likely to experience delays as well. So this means that actually a lot of our young people will have to effectively go through their transition without medical support for years. And what we're noticing since the cash review is that more and more young people are having to go through the puberty just because of the waiting list and the cash review. So they are having to go through, see, for example, I'm talking about a trans female, she's having to go through male puberty and is very, very alarmed by this and is causing serious mental health problems because even though she came out at a young age, the waiting list means she will most likely not get even an appointment. She's been told until she's about 17. And she's already seeing the effects of testosterone in her body. So here's my question to you. How do you think having additional support need could impact a child's understanding of waiting for NHS treatment? What do you guys think in your experience of time? Ashley, I'd love to see your dissertation if you want to share that with me. That would be cool. I apologize if you can hear music. My upstairs neighbors are blaring it and there's nothing I can really do. So apologies. Do any of your young people oh, here's one here. Is it Bill? No, it's Alison. Hey, hi, Alison. It can be very difficult to keep them engaged with support services if they fail to see any benefit. Yes. If that immediate transaction is not true, absolutely. I am not sure we currently have the level of clinical expertise to scaffold support. Absolutely, I agree. I absolutely agree. I am not a gender specialist. I am not a psychiatrist. I'm a teacher who's ended up talking about this, and I'm in no way an expert, but for some reason, my job has primarily to do this. And I think if people were to look, I would love to in the future get some qualifications. Currently, I've got an autistic 3-year-old. There's no way I'm doing that, but absolutely. And yes, you've got a good point. The learning disability, if you do have a learning disability, that's an immediate barrier. Because when we're talking about and learning about gender, because it is such an abstract concept, that's an immediate barrier that can be there for a lot of our kids as well. Even I'm thinking about the concept of time, the concept of waiting. A lot of our children have time blindness where they can't identify the difference between 3 months and 6 months, or even 3 months and 3 years. So, especially when you have this urgency, and especially when you're feeling gender dysphoria and you're seeing the changes happen in your body so quickly, you probably, when you think about your puberty, some of it felt like it happened overnight. And when all of that is happening so quickly, you can sometimes feel like the waiting list for getting support can feel like it's endless, and it never will end. So that's a huge barrier as well. Thank you for sharing for people who were able to share. Um, if there are unexpected delays, absolutely. Even there was one person that I was working with, and they finally got an appointment at the gender identity clinic, and they got COVID, so they couldn't go. It was as simple as that, right? And so they were back in the waiting list for 4 months to get another appointment. It could be something as simple as that. If someone's had, for example, a meltdown, and it means they cannot attend the session because they're not able to verbalize how they're feeling, then once again, that can be a barrier. So it's not just thinking about long term, it can be what's happening in the day, what's happening with the health of the individual. Absolutely. Um, Okay, so how to help autistic young people explore their gender. I think the first thing is thinking about concrete means. There's this wonderful resource called the Genderbread Person. I have been talking about this for a decade now. It's just so great. I use it all the time to talk about, because it kind of tries to make something that's not black and white into black and white. So the identity is in your brain, who you fancy, who you're attracted to is in your heart, your private parts are what you were born with or what you want to medically transition to, and the expression is how do you show yourself to the rest of the world. And there's an example of this I'll show you. There's actually now a gender unicorn, which goes down very well as well. So finding concrete means can be great. Also, multiple choice questions makes a difference. Writing, drawing, finding ways to express feelings. I have used Thomas the Tank Engine as a way to talk about feelings, because there's a great, I think it's on YouTube now, of Thomas the Tank Engine showing different visuals of facial expressions to talk about that, because that was the special interest of the individual in that moment. Um, Also thinking about how they currently experience life and how they expect to be different. A lot of our kids might not know that transphobia exists. And I spend a lot of my time talking about this, because if you have an incredibly supportive community, an incredibly supportive family, an incredibly supportive school who have been with you all the way, they might have never actually experienced any sort of transphobia. Also, when it comes to thinking about dating, if they're suddenly starting to be attracted to other people, do they need to come out to them? How does that work if they are pre-transition? All of these are conversations that are really difficult to have, but we need to talk about the practicalities of engaging with other people, even if it's just around conversations and transphobia. As I said, as that the potential reactions of others, positive and negative. One individual, for example, she really wanted to have um, scripts of what to say when people said certain things to her. So she scripted back answers, and she practiced the answers, because in that moment she knew she would feel really stressed. So now she has a bank of answers to when people ask her horrible questions or make horrible comments, and they're all really, really funny, which is actually also a plus. And she's able to use them to support her moving forward as she gets older and goes into adulthood. And also time. I think the idea that you might need to explain that you have to come out a lot. It's not just coming out right now, it's when you go to college. It might be when you go to work. Especially when I'm thinking of the young people who are socially transitioned but aren't medically transitioned. That it might be that actually they have to come out again and again and again, all through their life. And that can be really challenging because if they suddenly have a sense of their selves and they have a confidence with that, having to then share that and knowing that there might be potentially negative aspects to that is something that a lot of autistic children and young people don't necessarily expect or know about really until we have that conversation. No problem, Leanne. Thank you. Yes, we will share the slides. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. Okay, it is 2:32. Look at that timing. Shall we take a 5-minute break if that's okay? Please get yourself a cup of tea, whatever you need to do. I'll say, please come back at, but it'll be fine. It'll be fine. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming back. I hope that was enough time for people to do what they need to do. Before we move on to the case studies and get into the meaty part of the webinar, does anyone have any questions or comments they want to make before moving forward? No, we're all right. Okay.
I'm going to make a comment, I'm afraid, and
Go
that's
for it,
just
Bill.
and that is I think the moot point for me, so involved in residential care and education, is where you get a confusion
Mhm.
around identity rather than yes, I am.
Yes,
I do
yes,
trans.
yes.
It's this grey area where, and that poses huge problems, I think, for parents and for education professionals and others involved in the degree to which you use language which allows people to be confused
Yeah,
rather than directing them one way or the other. And
yes.
I'm too long in the tooth perhaps now for me to adapt my vocabulary and my language, but it poses as a teacher, you have this filter and you have to adapt the filter according to age groups and according to ability levels and so on. And that's a filter I don't have the professional expertise yet to employ. And that would concern me if I was still in professional practice, I think.
Yeah. And I think something I get a lot of is, well, this I get a lot of referrals and immediately, well, this person, oh my goodness, we think this person's trans. And I'm like, why? Oh, they've changed their name to this. And it isn't actually until we delve deeper that, and even the fact that a young person might want to change their name, they might decide on one name and actually think, well, that doesn't suit me anymore. I would like to do that. That sometimes can blow people's mind, the idea that they have to use a different name as well. So absolutely it can be yeah. We don't ask neurotypical heterosexual people to define whether they are heterosexual when they're 16. So why are we necessarily asking that of our autistic young people as well? Okay, so this is what we're here for, anonymized case studies. I should tell you in advance, I have a real soft spot for both of the people involved in these case studies. I think they're just some of the most wonderful human beings in the world. So you'll probably hear that through my work. So these are going to show the complexities of an inclusive approach, very different experiences of the young people as well, both autistic. Let's look at them. So here we've got Lisa. So this is obviously not her real name. Lisa is 12. She actually told her mum that she was a girl when she was 10, so she was relatively young compared to some of the young people that I've worked with. And what they decided to do was they moved to a different area so that she could socially transition in that area and also for the school. So she now goes to an ASN school, and through that, it was almost like a fresh start for her. And I think that was very much what mum wanted. She wasn't necessarily out at school. In fact, most of the teachers didn't necessarily know that she was a trans girl because I think she was prepubescent as well. So she presented very feminine gender expression. So not many people actually knew at school that she was trans. And in fact, it was a surprise to some of the management as well when they found out. Very popular girl, had lots of boyfriends, very socially aware within her peer group as well. She had been outed by her neighbor in her neighborhood. And that was really difficult for her because she was a girl that went out and played at night, and all of that just completely shut down, and that was a real blow to her because she's someone who needs a lot of physical input, and for her to have this peer group outside of her school that involved neurotypical children with a sport needs, a real mixture, to suddenly for that to disappear, that was really, really devastating for her as an individual. She has the most incredibly supportive mother I've ever met in the world, and a really supportive school as well. So this is the kind of background to Lisa, who she is, and how I suppose how I met her in the moment. Now, why was she referred? First of all, I think gender dysphoria was the biggest one, and real concerns about that, especially around self-harming. So she requested actually herself to not, for example, go into home economics and not go into techie class because she was worried that if she would be around blades or around sharp things, that she would potentially cause harm, specifically cutting off parts of her body that she found quite alarming to herself. She kept on asking her mum when she was getting her period, and she kept on talking about how excited she was to have a baby. So there was a great understanding, a lack of understanding around pregnancy, around periods, around being a trans girl and how those interconnect. Um, and also she had quite unrealistic expectations of timelines because she was told, well, you're young, so when you get referred young, you'll be seeing very early. And then, of course, the cash report came out, and that was quite devastating for her as an individual as well. But also, very little understanding of her own vulnerability as well. So, how did we make our approach inclusive to meet Lisa's additional support needs? Let's see. Where the boyfriend's aware, this is something that can be tricky and affect the others in the situation. I think Elsa, because of the people in this, confidentiality wise, I don't think I could necessarily. But I'm sorry, I don't think I can go into this one just for this individual, sorry, just without kind of breaking confidentiality. No problem, Shazia. Yes, we'll make sure we send you the slides in Urdu. But yes, the situation with outing or themselves, especially if you have someone who's trans and quote unquote passes, can be really difficult because that's a difficult conversation to have. I think luckily this individual had very um, juvenile, very innocent relationships when it came. There wasn't necessarily a lot of sexual touching, so it wasn't relevant at the time, but it's certainly something that we have to talk about within it because, as you say, it can be something very tricky. And also, it can be something that can put a lot of, especially our trans girls, can be in serious, serious danger. And that's something that I have to talk about devastatingly with a lot of our trans girls of, listen, you might not necessarily feel that you need to come out, and we agree with that, but just to let you know, if you are in a situation where you might have sexual contact with someone and they don't know that your private parts don't necessarily align with your gender expression, then that might cause rage, that might cause violence to other people. So it's thinking about how we talk about that, and how we navigate that, but it's a really, really difficult thing to think about. But thank you for pointing it out. So, how did we support her? Let's find out. Oh, so first thing is we did the gender unicorn. This girl loves a unicorn. So we showed this example, and actually I had to adapt this because it was too complicated for her. Because actually talking about physically attracted wasn't in any way relevant to our conversations. And she made that clear. I was there to help her learn. She kept on saying, "You're helping me to learn to be a girl." And my response was, "Well, you are a girl. It's just learning about what kind of girl you are and how you're going to proceed through the world as a girl." So this is a really good one because it allows people to think about. And what I like about this one that's a little bit different to the genderbread person is for the private parts here, it's the DNA, which is interesting because that's not necessarily what you were born with, it's what the DNA says. And I think that can be quite affirming for a lot of people. Um, so what we did with her is me and her filled these out ourselves. So we didn't talk about sexual attraction because that wasn't relevant to her, and she made that clear. And we didn't talk about emotional attraction too. But we talked about gender identity, we talked about gender expression. And I was actually the first non-binary person that she had ever met. So she was asking me questions. And I think it was almost quite useful for me to be like, oh, look, my gender identity is a little bit different than, say, yours is. And why do you think that might be? So, coloring in, engaging in this way was really good fun, and she really, really enjoyed it. And I've made sure that you've got the resource there for her too. So that was the first thing. I think this was almost part of the assessment to see how she understood her own body, how she understood her own identity. And she was very clear from the start, I am a girl, I feel like a girl, my gender identity is, my gender expression is. So by doing an activity like this, I was able to show physically that she had a strong understanding of this, which was part of really my work. Lisa also needed very structured sessions, very, very structured sessions, and she needed time for her special interest. So what we used to do, because she would get sometimes a little bit, I wouldn't say overstimulated, but she would ruminate sometimes. So we would cut ourselves off and we would have a conversation about something, and then we would go back to what we were talking about. And that really made a difference to it. And her absolute special interest is storms. So I would do things like bring TikTok videos of a storm that I'd seen in Florida, or she would teach me all about clouds. And clouds actually became a metaphor in a way to talk about how different clouds have different ways of being. They have different um, methods of raining. They're just different in the way that they exist in the world. And she was the one that said, so am I kind of like a different cloud to a cisgender cloud? And I was like, yeah, yeah, you're a different cloud. That's so we were able to connect her special interests to her understanding of her own gender as well. But also it gave us a little bit of a break, and it meant that it wasn't such an intense session, because it can be quite difficult for a young person, especially depending on what kind of day they've had, right? To be able to come in. And twice now with this individual, I have abandoned the session within 5 minutes because it was very clear that the individual wasn't able to have these conversations based on their mental state at that point because of an incident that happened, or maybe they're feeling sick or something like that. So sometimes part of the work is abandoning ship before we even really start to protect the mental capacity. Also, for this individual, they needed specific language to be used. The use of the word penis was very, very upsetting for them, and they didn't ever want to hear it. And at home, they talked about an outgrown vagina, so we adapted that. And we talked about an outgrown vagina rather than about a penis. And we talked about how she sees that her outgrown vagina is a vagina, it's just it comes out rather than goes in. And that actually worked really well, because when we were talking about medical transitions and making a vulva and a vagina out of a penis, that she was like, oh my goodness, it is an inside out vagina, because that's how they make a vaginal wall. I'm like, yeah, yeah, absolutely. So that was really affirming for her. Um, but one of the things that came up was that some trans girls decide to get an operation to remove their penis when they're older, and some don't. Now, this is really important for a lot of our, especially autistic, uh, trans and gender non-conforming children. And even when I'm thinking about sexuality, you don't have the idea that you don't have to make a decision, or you don't have to look a certain way, you don't have to have certain operations. I think our sense of what it means to be transgender is changing quite a lot. It used to be, well, if you're transgender, you must remove whatever genitalia you have. You have to get top surgery. But now we're finding more and more young people are saying, well, actually, no, that's not part of my gender identity. And actually doing some of the surgeries you get can be quite traumatic to the body. And even thinking about the hormonal things, I'm thinking about people who go on testosterone, for example. My brother-in-law, bless his heart, was furious for a good year. He really, really struggled with going through a second puberty and the sensory overload of that, and the amount of anger and rage he had, and the drastic changes that were in his body. And it did happen very, very quickly for him. He lost his hair, for example. And he went from having the most luscious locks to just being an absolute baldy head with a big ginger beard. But he wasn't expecting that, and that change and that shift in his personal appearance that was so quick was quite alarming for him. So yeah, that's another example of thinking about the language that we use. Also for the individual we're talking about, Lisa, she struggled to apply the learning to her story. She struggled to apply the learning to her experience, but she really liked doing kind of agony aunt style scenarios. So I would make up scenarios, and actually, a lot of them weren't made up. They were from conversations I was having with other young people. And then she would help me figure out how to support the individual. And then we would talk about how that might be relevant to her as a way to link up her experience. So, for example, says, "Hi, Lisa. Sometimes people try to bully me in the area I love. There's this one person who said their dad says I'm actually a boy, and I know I am not. He keeps telling me I can't be a girl because I have a penis, outgrown vagina. I feel like a girl and dress like a girl, so I don't get it. Can you help me, please?" And Lisa was able to say, "Oh my goodness, this happened to me." I'm like, "Oh, really? It happened to you? That's such a coincidence, you know?" But she was able to link with this girl, Amna. And actually, some of the characters became characters that Amna became a character that we went back and forth with quite a lot over about the year that we worked together. So using characters that are heavily linked, but not so that they necessarily understand that they're linked, could made a difference to Lisa as well. And what is the difference? What is the impact for Lisa? So first of all, she's out and proud at school. Now, not necessarily with everyone, right? But a lot more people know that she's a trans girl. There's now an LGBTQIA plus group that happens at lunchtime once a week. And she was one of the founders of it. She came out to people. She actually says she doesn't want to go anymore because it's a bit boring, which to me actually is great, right? Because what people are doing is they're coming out and they're learning about gender sexuality, and she's going, "Ah, I know all about that now." So she feels that she doesn't necessarily need that support in the way that she used to. She's still not finished. The reality is, I think I'm going to be working with Lisa for the rest of her school career, potentially further on as well. So that's something that we need to keep in touch. I think it's the idea that, oh, you have 4 to 6 sessions and then the person disappears. For this individual, the capacity within the staff meant that they wanted me to come back and do more. Um, Gaynor has said, "Unfortunately, there are few people like you to provide this kind of work. Where do you go for the kind of help you can provide?" Honestly, Gaynor, I don't know because I'm the only person I know that does it. I'm so sorry, but I've put my email at the bottom. LGBT Youth Scotland, for example, are a great resource. They might be able to know people. But it's a really good question, Gaynor. And as far as I know, I'm the only person that does it, which is, I think, really challenging. Um, really strong connections with family. So, like, I have mum's personal email. Uh, we had a fight that with the local authority. So within this local authority, when you get through, for example, a permission form, it says your son or your daughter. And this individual got a bit of paper that said your son is going on a school trip, and Lisa just it ruined the rest of the week for her. She then got another one from SQA or something where it said your son, and we worked with the Scottish Child Law Centre, and they wrote a lovely and gently threatening email to say this goes against the UNCRC. This shouldn't be something. If you're, for example, getting a referral to CAMS and the CAMS service misgenders you within the referral letter, then that's not okay. So at first it was the school. They were very proactive about it. They changed it internally, but now at a local authority level, every single child, when they get permission form, gets your child rather than your son or your daughter. But the reality is she's still struggling with gender dysphoria. She looks very different to me, at least, than she did a year ago. And that is only going to become more and more relevant to her as she grows up. When I met her, she was pre-puberty. She's now going through male puberty, and it's becoming a real issue for her. So this isn't I don't think there's ever a clear-cut success story when it comes to any of our kids. But, the fact that she feels she has a better understanding of her journey was, I think, the biggest thing for her as well. So kind of that's where Lisa comes from. Oh, why is it suddenly frozen?
I think one of the key things that also worth a point worth making is that you worked with the family, and
Yes.
it is with the mother, and again there'd be people attending who are saying that's all very well, but there'd be situations where the family are not supportive,
Yeah.
and the work that might need to be done by someone like yourself is actually with the family rather than with the young. Well, you're working to try to educate and help the family understand as much as the young person.
I think you're right. And Bill, I'm going to do in the next case study an example of that. And I think when it comes to family, it can be really difficult. I got a call from a mum who didn't remember it was me. Remember I told you about the mechanic, the girl who's the mechanic, and her mum told her she couldn't transition until she left home. And there's nothing, it's a really difficult conversation to have because um, this young woman loved her mum, and her mum was our main support system. And then I got a call from her mum just before Christmas to say, "Oh, we don't know each other, but I was given your number. Um, my son's leaving and is now going to be a girl, and I don't know how I feel about that." And she hadn't made connected the dots that actually I know her daughter and I know her well. Um, so it can show that sometimes with all the will in the world, parents can take years. They can take, for this individual, it was 8 years later. She was still having issues with her parents. So you're right, Bill, that the parents can be an issue. As I've said here, sex specific language. The school had lots of training, so they had 2 half days to talk about gender and sexuality. Some of it was very challenging. The support staff also got training, so every single member in that school got gender and sexuality training, and that made a huge difference. And some of the professional transphobic views were challenged as well within policy and upper management. So it was lovely to see everyone come round, Lisa, and help her. And actually, most of it she doesn't know what happened because it's not relevant to her existence as an individual. So before we move on to the next case study, does anyone have any questions about Lisa before we move on to Marley? No, we're okay. Okay, right. Let's talk about Marley. Marley's a completely different story. So Marley uses he, him, and they, them pronouns, but primarily he, him. So I'm going to be referring to he, him. That's what he asked for today. 16-year-old autistic, very low school attendance, which in itself was a barrier because I would, have to call in and say, is this person going to be at school? And 50% of the time it wasn't. So we were supposed to do minimum 6 sessions, and it's been 8 months, right, of just continuing, and that can be really difficult. Gender non-conforming, very much out with friends. So friends use their preferred name of Marley. Out with mum and gran, but there were some challenges about where or when they could be out. But mum and gran are incredibly supportive human beings. It's just sometimes the understanding isn't there, the knowledge isn't there. And this person was part of a small LGBTQIA social group. So there was 4 of them. All of them are queer, and I think that was a really important thing for him to have this really close group of friends who all were exploring their own queerness together, which is wonderful. Reasons for referral: well, mum and gran unsure if it's a phase. Well, if it's probably a phase. She'll grow out of it. These are the types of things that we hear a lot from parents. Um, he was very withdrawn in school, except from those 2 peers that I was talking about, and wasn't necessarily willing to talk about gender with the teachers in school. So wasn't willing to engage with the conversation, even though the school knew that it was something that was impacting his mental health and his ability to attend school and his ability to engage with learning. Also, he used different names and pronouns with different people and other staff members. So he, for example, if he really liked a teacher, he would go to the teacher and say, "Can you call me Marley?" But for the other ones who he didn't trust or didn't like, he wouldn't ever have those conversations. So there was a real mixture of that. And for me as a practitioner, I had to say his dead name, and Marley because of that, because there was a confusion over names. And I think, but here's the thing, Marley didn't see any problem with that at all. I think that was part of it, is getting frustrated when some members of staff weren't using their preferred name of Marley, but other times having no expectations of other staff. So that was quite confusing as well for him and for the staff as well. So what was the approach? Honestly, it didn't go well at first. And I think I wanted to show this one because sometimes it doesn't go well, right? Sometimes it doesn't work out. So he didn't want to engage with me in any way. He didn't want to answer any questions about their gender. Um, and very unsure of who or how they wanted to come out. And I think that was really interesting, is that when they did talk about it, there was a lot of shrugs, there was a lot of non-verbalness. We did some texting, but honestly, we couldn't even do the genderbread person because they weren't able to gauge where they were in that resource. So there was a lot of I don't knows. There was a sense of, well, I know I'm transmasc, but apart from that, transmasculine means masculine, trans, but in the more masculine spectrum. But that was kind of all they were willing to talk to me about. And that was really difficult because if someone doesn't want to engage with me, but they also don't attend school, how do I get through that? How do I break down that barrier? So one of the things we started talking about, because the school asked me to, was about the idea of coming out, because they thought, well, this person wants to come out. They had just had gender and sexuality training from us. They're like, right, we're going to make sure that everyone uses the word Marley. The name Marley, everyone was going to use the right pronouns. So this was one of the slides, for example, that I used. So this person really enjoyed using slides and reading them, and took a long time to process them. So I said, Corey's going to help Marley decide what he wants to do about coming out at school. Corey knows what Marley uses a different name and pronouns now. Other people in the school might not know this. So Corey can help Marley decide what he wants people to call him and what pronouns to use. Now, this is where theory of mind came into place, because theory of mind is the idea of other people might have differing opinions or thoughts or compared to you, different experiences of the world. And Marley genuinely didn't understand why some teachers wanted to call him Marley when he didn't want that, because he had no interest in those teachers, because as far as he was concerned, that's not a supportive teacher. And that, I think, also it kind of offended some of the teachers, because some of the teachers thought they had a better relationship than they did with Marley. So it brought up a lot of the complications around that teacher-student profile as well. But this was the session where they were like, I don't want to do this anymore. And I was like, okay, I need to think about why. What is it that I did wrong? And that's when I decided to write an apology letter. So this is the letter. Now I have changed it to kind of make sure it's anonymized, but I basically said, I want to apologize because I assumed that you wanted to come out. I assumed that you wanted to have these conversations. I assumed that you wanted to talk about the future and moving on. But actually, if you want me to stop talking about that, we can. And actually, if you would like to bring topics to me, I would absolutely love that. And I sent this to them in an email through the school. And they then asked to write back to me. So we started doing a writing back and forth. Oh, oh, it's thinking about it. It's thinking about it. Oh no, right, here we are. So I said, so what do you want to do? And they said, well, can you give me guiding questions? And I was like, absolutely. So this was it, right? My name is, I am this years old. My pronouns are, I don't really mind, but I am. So that I don't really mind, I highlighted that in purple because for them, they genuinely didn't mind how they were identified on the gender spectrum. They genuinely didn't care. They're like transmasc-ish because he wasn't sure. He really wasn't sure. And he needed time to process that as well. I'm in the school. I want most people to call me. I want these people to call me Marley. So he actually identified his friends and his mum and his dad and two teachers in the school that actually being called Marley was really, really important for them. Sorry, I realize I'm running late, guys. Also, if someone calls me this name by mistake, I might feel X, Y, and Z. So this is when they answered these questions and then told me, I think I have DID, dissociative identity disorder, which is when you have different people, it's difficult to say, different identities within your brain. One person might front. It's a way for a lot of people who have trauma to dissociate and protect themselves. There's not a lot of research on it, but that's when they said, I think I have DID. And I was like, okay, so we watched some videos about DID and gender. We talked about how sometimes if you've got DID, you might not know how to medically or socially transition because you might change your mind. And this is something that he was saying, is that sometimes when I was asking him questions, the people in his brain were arguing over who was going to speak to me first. I was like, so there's a debate going on in your brain before you're even able to speak to me about it. So what did we do? We learned about DID together. We looked into the research of DID and autism. There's very, very little. We did some initial assessments on DID. As I said, I am not an expert. I just found a dissociation kind of starter template. And eventually he asked to be referred to CAMS. Now, at first he was like, no, 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 I don't want to, because my mum says it's just a phase. My mum says this is me just being autistic. But after learning about what DID is and how it might be affecting his understanding of his own gender, then he went, right, okay, I think I might need some help with DID before I think about my gender expression and my gender identity. I was like, okay. So that's kind of how we dealt with that. What was the impact? Mum bought a binder, which was huge. We didn't think mum would be up for that. Now the binder is a piece of clothing that impacts someone's chest and allows the chest to be smaller. He only wears it around the house, but we're hoping that changes. He's excited for the first time to talk about his gender. He's excited that he's got a CAMS referral, and before he was scared of it. He used to talk about his secret of having DID, but also he knows he doesn't want any medical information at the moment, and that he doesn't need to at any point. He thought, well, if I come out as trans, then I need to have this operation, I need to have this hormones, and we're going, absolutely not. You can decide whether or how you express your gender. So what's the outcome for the community? The pupil has asked certain people to have preferred names and pronouns. In school, all of the kids call him by Marley, all of them. So obviously there's been some sort of communication. The school have now had training. We've been meeting up with mum and gran to discuss the learning. So it's been really, really impact for him as well. And I'm not going to pause for any questions just because we're running late. I'm so sorry, guys. It's not like me to run over. So what are the summary genders? Such a personalized experience. I needed to not assume that somebody wanted the kind of support that I was wanting to give them. Different communication styles are so integral. I ended up typing more than I did anything else with Marley. Different teaching approaches are integral as well, but also young people have drastically varying degrees of support, including within their school as well. I'm not got time to go over these, but here are all the statistics about what it's like to be trans and not be heterosexual, and the impact it has on hate crime, on mental health. So please do have a look at this as well. Here's all the research we used. As you can see, there's a lot of it. Here are some wonderful resources that might be useful for you moving forward for supporting your transgender and LGBTQIA pupils. Also, we have an inspirational and reflective reading list. You can find this at our website on aiseecollaborative.co.uk. Tom literally wrote it today. He combined all of the 99 suggestions from our community. So if this is something that you think would be relevant, please do have a look at our website. And then finally, what's next? We're going to be doing another webinar called Surviving Parenthood, Raising Neurodivergent Children and Not Losing Your Shit. And this will be me and Tom, and we are 2 generations apart, talking about our experience of being neurodivergent, raising neurodivergent children. And Bill is going to facilitate this and ask questions, and it's going to be very, very casual and informal, but I think it's going to be really interesting. I'm very excited to see how our experiences have differed. I've put the event right there for you, but can I ask you, if the people who are still here, can you maybe do an evaluation for me if that's okay? Well, how it usually works is you get a QR code, but Bill has already put into the chat as well the evaluation link, but I'll put it in as well just in case. This really helps us understand what you want more of, what you liked about this, what you think could be better about this. Obviously, timing would be one of them. I also have here the AISee Collaborative email address and the Three Sisters email address. So you've got everything you really need from us.
Thanks, Corrie. That was brilliant. And I think what comes through is not only your professional insight, but your professional humility in that in this area of complexity. It's there are very few experts, and I raised the question about clinical expertise and the lack of in Scotland. You have to go down to the southeast of England to find
Yeah,
tier four professionals in terms of clinical work. But direct working with young people and the case studies and the multiple case studies that you have can be very illuminating, including where it works and when it doesn't work. And the point you raised about communication style.
yeah,
I would like to reinforce that sometimes the one of the best ways of communicating in a less overtly or potentially hostile way is by writing.
yeah,
And young people often seem much more comfortable about sharing their views when they're writing than direct face to face.
yeah.
You will see from the topics that we're doing, I suppose, are not in a sense mainstream, but ought to be mainstream. So we're going into
Yes,
the difficult areas. There is a considerable overlap between this topic and neurodivergence and offending behaviors,
yeah,
where offending is in inverted commas. And what we have to say is if we want to solve some of Scotland's problems with the overcrowded prisons and the wrong people being in prison or people being in prison who shouldn't be there, really shouldn't be there, it's because there aren't enough Corrie McLeans around to do the sort of
hey,
work that is going to prevent them engaging in behaviours that society doesn't find particularly appropriate. We haven't had time to talk about incels, for example, and I think that
yeah,
is very interesting.
yeah.
But hopefully, this was in a sense a taster session.
Hmm.
What Corrie says about throwing ideas forward, please do that because
Yes,
we as a team work together and develop presentations that hopefully will hit home. And audience participation, particularly from parents, because I always say that parents are the expert or an expert,
yes.
or have a form of expertise. Then I think parental experience is particularly useful, as is the experience of practitioners in case studies. But thank you very much for attending. Please do fill in the evaluations. Please do throw forward some suggestions about anything that we might cover in future. And we look forward to seeing you at the next event.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, and we'll hopefully see you soon. Thanks, guys. See you soon. Bye.
Bye.